how important has it been to kind of get in touch with your Chinese identity? I guess this is kind of getting at the maybe the cultural tensions or challenges of being on leadership in a Chinese heritage church. Um, I guess what are some things that you can say to maybe someone that's listening who's a second or third generation, um, ABC, as we call them. Um, what are some benefits or what are some things that they can do to get in touch with it if there are, and maybe even just in a larger, more pragmatic sense, what is the benefit of staying in the Chinese church? I mean, Hanley touched on that, being willing to stick it out, if you will, to be that bridge for as a young adult, as an adult, as someone that maybe is raising a family, even in some of our contexts, and I guess the Chinese identity portion of it. I know we're kind of in a cultural moment where that's kind of vogue too, where that seems to be a different way, maybe nuanced way of answering that, maybe than say 5, even 10 years ago, at this moment that we're in. But maybe whoever wants to chime in on that.
Yeah, for me, my original call to ministry what had to do with hearing about how Chinese Americans was a huge mission field. And I think all of us know who Steve Chin is, kind of legendary English pastor from Boston. And I remember I was going to this little conference where he was speaking to some Chinese American pastors. He brought this up. He was like, "This is the harvest. This is the mission field that Jesus is calling workers to." When you look at how many Chinese Americans there are in America, and the percentage of them that are evangelical Christians is very low, very low. I forget the exact percentage, much lower than Koreans. But you see, comparatively, there's the amount of churches in America is not, the percentage wise is low, and and then what compelled me also was Steve Chin was saying there are not a lot of second generation Chinese Americans in seminary. There are just not that many pastors. And that also has to do with the uniqueness of our culture. I think that it's really hard to be a pastor as a Chinese American. It's being a pastor is not something our parents want us to do. It's not regarded as you know, a noble thing most of the time. I'm thankful my parents, they were very supportive. But yeah, for me, that was a specific calling that I felt like I was a Chinese American, grew up in a Chinese church. I understood the different struggles of Chinese Americans and that God was maybe calling me to minister to those who were like me. And yeah, it's just a huge mission field. It is a huge mission field. There's so many Chinese Americans who need the gospel and who have unique things about them that need to be spoken to. And so, yeah, that's kind of my story there.
Yeah, I think when Joey was talking about, his experience of being a Chinese American in ministry or a Chinese heritage minister, and when you are in the space of white majority culture, surrounded by different pastors of different ethnicities, I think we're always trying to ask ourselves, like, how should I present myself? Do I make a joke about myself as the, you know, funny, something funny about Asian culture, or how do they see me? Um, and actually, I think that question is harder for me to actually deal with. I don't think I've ever dealt with that. Like I think like what Ben's saying a little bit, is asking ourselves, who we are. I think for Joey, you grew up, I think in the Midwest or something where uh, it was more pronounced that you're Chinese. But growing up in Southern California in a suburb where you're surrounded by Asians, maybe we don't have to ask ourselves that question until we got into ministry and we're realizing, oh, there's a majority culture. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what I think. It's a journey for me. It's a process right now, trying to figure out what it means to be uh, a Chinese American or North American pastor.
Well, I don't know if you're alluding to this in that, Casey, but like I think one of the questions implied, which we're trying to get at, is what is there a legitimacy for English-speaking ministries that are ethnically specific over the long haul? I mean, first generation and immigrants totally makes sense because it's distinctly obvious that language, culture, they're not American. But like you have a long enough time, is there a need, or is it even legitimate to have an ethnic ministry? And I've been wrestling with that for quite some time too, because we also have this movement, which, I'm not against, I'm actually for the idea of seeing greater diversity, multi-ethnicity, but like, is that's sometimes used as like a criticism against ethnic specific ministries. Although interestingly, if you ever listen to the conversations, it's often not criticizing, well, majority white churches. It's also not criticizing majority Black churches because no one's going to do that. But somehow it's uniquely criticizing Chinese ones or Korean ones. For some reason, this lack of diversity within our spheres gets criticized. And I don't have an answer for that other than just observing that like that's part of the journey. And that's the question people ask. Is there legitimacy for Chinese American churches that are English speaking over the long haul that maybe even not attached to a immigrant church anymore like Ben's? If you give it 50 years, if that relationship is, different or just evolved or dissolved in the 50 years from now, like, will there be a legitimacy for Ben's church if it's still primarily Chinese American, English speaking? Is that okay? And I feel like even asking that question seems strange today because people almost automatically presume it's going to be multi-ethnic. And that's not to criticize that. Again, I'm not against that. I'm actually for that. I think our churches could see more of that even from the Chinese ones, but somehow uniquely it's criticizing the Asian ones, the Chinese ones, like, how come you're not more diverse? And I hear that from our own people, right? Like, oh, they leave our churches often because of a lack of diversity. But then that direction of increasing diversity is usually departing the Chineseness versus coming to the Chineseness. And I find that to be very strange. Why can't it be the other way around as well? No one judges the white churches or the white Christians for not joining our churches.
Yeah, and I think the legitimacy question comes down to, I mean, let's just say that you don't have a language barrier and everybody understands English, or they're at least understanding Chinglish, so so we can have English only. What's the legitimacy? I think it comes down to your community. Where do you live? What's the demography? So I think there's a difference between being ethnocentrically Chinese and excluding others versus we happen to be a Chinese heritage church. We began as a mission to Chinese people. Now this community is still filled with Chinese people. So we're a community church, and the people who come, there's a lot of Chinese who come, and they're Chinese American. But in our tone, in our vision, in our preaching, and everything that we say, we make it very clear that we're not exclusive. That we're open to all ethnicities. And I think that's the difference. And again, I think that conversation is going to come different for different contexts and different churches. We've often talked about changing our name and taking the Chinese out. And then I think the conclusion is that that still might be a goal, but it would just be cosmetic because we have such a Chinese culture with the two other language congregations. Meaning, we could say that we're Walnut Community Church or something like that, but at the end of the day, when you come in, there's going to be some things that are translated. There's going to be some Chinese writing here and there. You're going to eat Chinese food, most likely. And so, in many ways, anybody who comes in, and we welcome anyone, they're going to know right away this is a Chinese church. And somehow they're going to have some affinity with Chinese culture. That's just how I think it's going to be that way in some of our churches for a couple generations, unless you're in a situation like Ben's where where he's independently planted out almost, at least a goal, right?
Yeah, it's interesting because we're independent, but we're still predominantly Chinese American. I do think that once we did plant, we did have more non-Chinese, non-Asian people visit than we ever did before, and so it did remove a barrier. And I think there's just this tension in our churches between appreciating, celebrating the fact that we are Chinese American, that God made us that way, and it's not something to be ashamed of. And also being challenged to go out of our comfort zone because of the gospel, because the gospel should push us um, to reach out to those who are different from us. And so there's definitely a temptation in Chinese American churches to be very inward, to be very comfortable because everyone's like me. This is kind of I'm here because I'm comfortable. And so I think that does need to be challenged. But Joey makes a great point, right? I mean, it doesn't, I think there still is a legitimacy to having a place where you can celebrate the fact that you're Chinese and be understood, right? So I think that's just an ongoing tension that needs to be continually discussed.
The English congregation obviously is in a very strategic place, the English speaking congregation in our Chinese heritage churches, whether it mean the direct linguistic bridge building with our communities, the majority culture being English speaking, or more obviously English speaking at least. I guess, what does it look like in your own churches, maybe in your own experiences, or maybe it's even in your own thinking, your own thought processes? What does it mean to see a Chinese heritage church with the English speaking now being more of the anchor, or being more of the bridge to the community? And I think our churches are kind of different, if you think of it as a spectrum of development in terms of church growth or church development over time. I guess kind of where you're standing, what does it look like for the English speaking congregation to be that? Aside from obviously the most pragmatic and traditional ends of it, which is help with children and youth ministries, right? Because that becomes a very obvious way of anchoring the importance of English ministries. We need your help, right? And here's a job for you to do. What are other ways in which we can facilitate that more widely, I guess, in our culture or in our locales, wherever we may be? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think to answer that, it's a bigger framework of putting our identity in Christ ahead of our Chinese identity. So there's still an upholding of the value of being Chinese, but we're Christian first. And so when you're talking about a Christian church in America, and you simply ask the question to any Chinese immigrant, why would you come here? And some of them might say, well, I'm going back to Asia, But why would you come here? It's to assimilate. It's because they believe that they came here to become, American in some sense while retaining some of their culture. And in many ways, it's an assimilation question, meaning every immigrant parent wants their kids to assimilate. And so English becomes the unifying language, if you will. So most Cantonese understand some level of English, and if they're from Hong Kong, they understand English well enough to function and at least hear a sermon. It's the Mandarin immigrants that are coming more recently that need a lot more translation. But at the end of the day, if there's one singular functional language, if we're just talking about language that could bridge all three Chinese congregations in some of our churches, it would be English. And I think it goes back down to the future. And I get it. If you have a church that's dominantly older generation immigrants, and you have just youth, they might not let the youth lead. But I think if a youth pastor stays long enough, and if families are built, and if you have enough emerging young adults, then eventually you have to allow the English to lead. It goes back to the question of, if every youth pastor leaves, then who do the youth have to look up to? And as they become adults, they leave too. And so the whole idea is that at a certain generation, there needs to be a stopgap where you need to allow the English pastor or English ministry to at least be equal to the Chinese congregations in decision making, in vision, in value, and setting the course of the direction of the church as a whole. And I think that's the healthiest, right? Because the English is the future in many ways. And so this kind of ties back, and I know I'm talking a little bit, but this goes back to, if we were Asian American pastors, or in a majority white culture church, what would it look like, right? We would probably have to tailor our philosophy of ministry, our sermon applications, and our ministries to majority culture. And we would be going with a framework of white evangelicalism or standard American evangelicalism. But I think the uniqueness of the English congregation in a Chinese heritage church is we specifically can contextualize and apply the gospel to deal with issues of people who are bicultural, or people who grow up in immigrant homes, or who are wrestling with their Asian identity. And we can actually deal with the idols, and we can hit it pretty hard and more directly. So I think for all of those reasons, if the Chinese Heritage Church wants a future, then the English has to have a prominent position. I feel like at least equal, if not anchoring. Um, and I like the word anchoring because it's not so much like, oh, we're leading, we're better, we're ahead, but we're anchoring, meaning when the English congregation flourishes, it should lead to the flourishing of both the Mandarin and the Cantonese.
Yeah, that's a generational baton passing. That's very difficult. And we actually probably only seen it a few times. The oldest Chinese churches in the country being in San Francisco, probably New York. LA maybe has a few, but like 100+ years in some of these old historic Chinese churches in Chinatowns. So those maybe have seen some, but like it's hard to pass that generational baton, especially because it's not only generational, it's also cultural, linguistic. But that has to be part of the framework. If we're answering the question, what's the future, or how can there be a better future for the Chinese Heritage Church? I think Hanley's right. Like, what made me want to stay in my Chinese Heritage Church here is the fact that they demonstrated that very clearly, because I was the youth pastor and now I'm the lead English pastor, and I became that when I was younger. And that was because the leaders were willing to try and pass the baton. If that did not happen, I don't know if I would have stayed long, because those who want to lead, who have that, then to have the desire to like not just be told what to do and they want greater ownership, they'll find it somewhere else. And so we tend to use power maybe in pejoratively when we're talking about ministry, because no one wants to grab power, but there is a power dynamic, whether we want to recognize it or not, that has to be given to another generation. And unless we do that, it's very difficult to see a positive future, because that generation of leaders will probably leave. That's very likely. That's regardless. You look at that in other cultural contexts too. Like if you don't pass the baton generationally, it's not going to be healthy. So it's just harder because you started these churches, Chinese Heritage Churches, because you were trying to create enclaves of safety and hopefully discipleship too. But there's definitely a cultural dynamic that they were trying to preserve, because they wanted that in this country, as they felt alienated and wanted something of their home. So like they may feel more difficult because it's really acknowledging and humbly admitting that the culture is evolving. There's a Chineseness that's different now. And that's actually very difficult for, I think, people to acknowledge. And just like for me, if I'm still in ministry and hopefully in 60, 70, 80, like if I'm passing it to another generation, it will be different and it'll be hard. I get that. I can empathize at least a little bit thinking about that into the future. Like I get how that's difficult, but that has to happen. Otherwise, we will lose that generation, regardless of if it's a Chinese Heritage Church. I think that power dynamic, thinking about blessing and empowering the next generation earlier than we would think. Like, most of us here are in 30s, 40s. Like, even if you have, I think Ben has like 3 kids, right? Like, even if you had like a bunch of kids, like you're still, if you are talking to a Chinese, 60-year-old, you're still a little kid to them, even if you've been a pastor for like 20 years. So.
Yeah, I would not be doing what I'm doing if it wasn't for my senior pastor. He really empowered me, and he really championed our church plant because he wanted to see the next generation reach for the gospel. And he was the one who led it, who led the charge in helping me to communicate this to the first generation and get more people on board. And he really fully supported. He didn't just allow it; he supported it and championed it. And yeah, I think that's what it takes. I mean, like Joey said, I've seen so many younger English-speaking pastors just leave the Chinese church, and it breaks my heart because, like Joey said, they're just if they're good leaders, they're going to go to a multi-ethnic church, majority white church, Asian American church, and where they can spread their wings. And oftentimes they'll bring, other young people with them. And so if the Chinese church, older generation, won't be willing to listen, at least listen, and allow younger leaders to try new things, then they'll just leave, which I think is sad.
But kind of in closing, kind of asking the dreaded question: from where you stand, where do you see where we're headed for the future of the Chinese American Church or Chinese Heritage Church? Just maybe generally, I don't want us to sound pretentious or like kind of know-it-alls, but just give us a kind of a quick take where you're at. What is the climate you think? With the weather forecast today, what is the climate in the future of where we're taking the Chinese Heritage Church or where it's going?
I feel like if I can answer this two ways, institutionally and then like just like the people. I think Chinese American Christians will continue to grow in number, and they'll intersect not only within institutional Chinese heritage churches, but people have said that Tim Keller, when he was the pastor of Redeemer, had the largest Chinese church in New York, right? So he was leading a Chinese heritage church in a sense. I think we will see greater integration into other church contexts. That's just going to be the way it is, because, and I'm not saying this negatively, like Ben is right, that trajectory that was mentioned by Steve Chin in the past is not any better today. There's still very few Chinese American pastors and people pursuing ministry. So if that's the case, probably more and more Chinese Americans will be in the larger cultural dynamic, which I think is still a good thing. I think the Chinese Heritage Church will see, hopefully, a passing of baton in some of the urban centers, I think, because they have some more like numbers there. But I do think it's probably like leaning towards greater integration, I think, into the larger culture. I don't mean that to be negative or not, but just I feel like that's just generally because we have not done enough to see the value and invest in future leaders. So there will be pockets of that which are really good and will maintain that, but that won't, in the current trajectory, that won't be the common trajectory of the Chinese Christian in this country. It'll be more integration into larger culture. So maybe I'll start with the negative view. Some of you will give you more optimistic.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's good. I think culturally, like we've mentioned, um, so I'm speaking culturally, not models of church, because I think there's no one model that we're certain that this is the model that's going to be effective for the future of the Chinese Heritage Church. But I think culturally, we do need to see um, a Chinese congregation or the immigrant leadership or the founding generation needs to be willing to pass the baton. At the same time, you need an emerging generation that's willing to take the baton. And that just takes time and relational building, relational trust that's built over time. And if that can happen, then I think those churches will thrive going forward. I think the churches who aren't able to do that well, they'll see their English congregation members or their youth eventually grow up and assimilate into other churches. But then I think there's a global aspect as well, is that as we see the global impact of Asia continue to increase in the wider culture, that there is a possibility that in the future, Chinese heritage churches with a very, very strong English ministry may become multi-ethnic. And the one thing about the Chinese Heritage Church is that we don't have the same we're not working through the same baggage of what we see today of black versus white, right? Of some of the racial tension that we see and the history of white evangelicalism and that whole discussion. We've always been kind of navigating what it means to assimilate. And so in many ways, we've always been kind of in the middle trying to figure out who we are. And some have said, and I don't know who to quote, but some have said that maybe if we continue down this route, we may be the peacemaker, someone who's neutral and able to navigate from the middle. So I think culturally and globally, there is a future for the Chinese Heritage Church in North America.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add. You guys said a lot of great things there. I think one thing to add is I think the immigration patterns are different. I think when we were growing up, it was, like my parents are from Hong Kong. It was like mostly like Taiwan and Hong Kong. and now all the Chinese immigrants are from mainland China. And I think if you see differences even in the second generation of kids of people from mainland China, they're different. And so it's hard to know how that generation will take the baton, what kind of ministries they'll start. Yeah, I mean, I would hope that there would be more young leaders that would that would be experimenting with things like I'm doing, and I also I do think that English ministry in a Chinese church can thrive. Like I think like you guys, and so I definitely don't think that my model is the only model that can survive in the future. But yeah, I do think that is the key. Is will they be given space to be creative, to express themselves, to do ministry in a way that makes sense to them, and we'll see.
All right. Thanks, guys, for your time, and I guess thanks for joining us.